Okay, hi everyone. So this is going to review the written example for assignment two. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip between this screen reviewing the going over the essay as well as the handout. All right. So you'll notice that I have the part one, part two, part three, part four in this written example. So there's part one, the introduction, part two, the literature review, part three, the research questions, and then part four, the outcome. Okay. All right, so now let me go back to the top of the page. So then you'll notice that I have my demographic information on the upper left-hand corner, where I have my name, the course that I'm taking, and then the due date. And then you'll notice that I have part one, like right under the demographic information, because what I do not want to see is someone starting their essay here, or I've had a few people start their essay almost towards the bottom of the page. But you'll notice that there's this huge empty space here. You do not want to have any empty space. All right. You want to make sure that you're able to have the structure of the essay at the way at the top, and then it allows you to have all this space to be able to write down your brilliant ideas about your particular topic on globalization and whatever issue you selected. Okay, so let me read through the introduction, and I'll show you where each section sort of lays within the paragraphs. So the object of study for this research proposal will be globalization and women. To narrow the scope of this research proposal, the study will focus on violence directed towards women. Globalization is a patriarchal structure. As such, women face many forms of gender-based violence. Patriarchy is a systemic structure that tends to serve the interests of men at the expense of women. The feminist perspective explains how patriarchy is closely associated with capitalism because much of the production of products under global capitalism is done by women's labor. This is known as the feminization of labor. As a consequence, many women face many forms of material and immaterial violence. Material violence towards women is direct physical violence targeting women, and immaterial violence is a form of psychological and emotional violence. For instance, a report from the Interparliamentary Union explains that women in the Asia Pacific region face a high rate of gender based violence. Women in politics, primarily in parliamentary structures, and then you see that I borrowed a quote. All right, so I have the open quote here, and these are the words that I borrowed. So 76% of women parliamentarians and 63% of the parliamentary staff have experienced psychological violence, which is a form of immaterial violence per the definition I provided. And then this is how we cite this in ASA, or the American Sociological in-text citation. Retrieved September 20th, 2025, and here is the URL. And then you'll notice after I wrote the quote, I explain how the quote relates to my topic. And this is something that you need to do. You never allow the quote to speak for itself because it cannot. When you use a quote, you have to make sure that you tell the reader why the quote is relevant and how it fits within the general scheme of your argument. I cannot stress this enough. You never just leave a quote without any type of intervention showing your reader why and how you're using it, because it is your responsibility as the writer to do that work. It is not the responsibility of your reader to do the work for you or to make those connections for you. It is upon you to be able to make those connections for the reader. Then the reader themselves can determine, one, if they agree with the connections that you're making, and how you're able to relate it to your topics. All right, that or to your topic. Okay. Okay. So yeah, sorry about that. My neighbor is working on his garden. All right. So this is what I wrote. The Interparliamentary Report clearly shows how women face immaterial violence, even portions of even in. Oh, sorry, that should be positions. Positions of power sharing with men, certain men still hold certain attitude towards women, even in governmental structures. So then, what happens to women who do not occupy positions of power affected by gender-based violence? Okay. Uh, yeah. Sorry about that. Should be tense. Didn't fix the tense. All right. So hopefully, does that make sense? So then, all right. So I just finished this. So then, basically, what I'm saying or suggesting here is that if women in positions of power still face forms of violence, either material or immaterial, is an issue. But then what happens when a woman who's not in a position of power, how does violence affect them? All right. And that would be sort of the main focus of what I would be looking at. All right. In the general body of the literature review, but also the overall study as well. Okay. Just to make that clear. Okay. So let me continue with the introduction. This issue, sorry, so this manuscript there. So this manuscript will focus on the question of how violence is structured towards women as a global phenomenon. Yes, sorry about the typos. Violence towards women impacts not only their overall health and survival, but it also produces stress, anxiety, and above all, violence dehumanizes women. So here I'm sort of sharing the issue of why I am wanting to write about violence towards women. Okay. As the study progresses, it will attempt to raise general awareness of the type of violence affecting women and potential solutions to address all forms of violence towards women. The significance of this study lies in drawing people's attention to the reality that many women face globally. This study was selected because of the way violence is directed towards women. As a child, I recall a friend's mother being victimized by her husband, and this experience has had a profound impact on how I understand interpersonal interactions between men and women, revolving around the question of violence. Okay, so you notice that it's the manner in which I wrote this is pretty much straight, direct. I'm not using flowery language. I'm not using a lot of needless words. So then this is how I expect you to write for a sociology class. It's a matter of fact. You're not necessarily imposing your personal opinion other than the section, which is point E or D. All right, for the introduction. That is the only personal information that you will provide. Everything else is just based off general knowledge that you should at least partially know as a sociologist or sociology student, and also some of the ideas from when our class discussions. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Now, let me go to the literature review. The four readings that will be used to aid in framing the object of study are Robin Cohen and Paul Kennedy's 2013 Thinking Globally, comma, Paul James and Manfred B. Steger, 2014, A Genealogy of Globalization, The Career of a Concept, comma, William I. Robinson's Globalization as Ethical Change in World Capitalism, comma, and Boa de Sousa Santos' Introduction, Creating a Distance in Relationship to Western-Centric Political Imagination and Critical Theory. And then you'll notice once I've listed the four sources, I write this small clause. Each of these readings will aid with the framing the question of globalization and violence towards women. Simple, clear, direct. You'll notice that I'm not wasting words, all right, as I write. Okay, so this is what you also should be striving for. All right, and this is known as the economy of language, where you could use much tighter language and much tighter descriptions and explanations and try to be very verbose and vague. This is very specific and direct type of writing. Okay. All right. So let me continue with this. All right. All right. So then this wrote, selecting these readings will help in developing a critical assessment of violence that women face. Because violence is a dehumanizing process, there is a need to understand how globalization structures violence towards women. All right. So then that is my introductory paragraph. Introducing the four sources, sort of summarizing in that clause how it will tend to help me frame my particular topic on this of the research focal point. All right, and then I start, since I first mentioned Cohen and Kennedy, so then I'm going to write about Cohen and Kennedy first. In writing, this is called parallelism. What you do at the beginning of the essay is you do the parallel work to make sure that you're logically and aesthetically coherent, or logically consistent throughout the paper. All right, sorry about that. I'm just trying to situate it so you could see just looking at the paragraph. So this is what I wrote about Cohen and Kennedy. So you notice I mentioned them their full name at the beginning, and then I'm just just writing their last name when I reference them again. Cohen and Kennedy's argument is to make readers more aware of what globalization is and how to begin to think about the world enveloping system. People have probably heard the term globalization, but may not have a clear and in-depth understanding of globalization, let alone how violence toward women is organized. Additionally, Cohen and Kennedy help readers understand how to begin conceptualizing global structures and processes. It is necessary for readers to understand the type of global structure that impacts people and communities. So you'll notice with this particular paragraph, I summarize the chapter in that one sentence. And then I continue with that same logic, but then I also tie it into violence towards women. This is how you integrate a source's ideas within the context and structure of your own argument. And that's what I'm going to be looking for. All right. When I start evaluating your essays, when you turn them into me on October 9th. Okay. Now, so then I'm going to continue with Cohen and Kennedy. Okay, one of the points Cohen and Kennedy make is to begin a sociological imaginary of globalization. Developing an imaginary can be traced back to C. Wright Mills, 2000, an American sociologist who wrote the sociological imagination to help people understand the relationship between an individual and society in general. Cohen and Kennedy make a similar intervention when it comes to conceptualizing global structures and processes. How does an individual understand and relate to a system that encompasses almost every corner of the world? So you'll notice with this particular paragraph, I take what they say in thinking globally, but then you'll also notice that I attach it to something that you should already know at this level of your sociology career, of who C. Wright Mills is and what is the sociological imagination per C. Wright Mills. By doing this, it helps you establish you as a competent and reliable sociologist, because you're referencing someone who has contributed a lot to the development of critical sociology. Okay. And then I make the connection back to Cohen and Kennedy, making that connection back to the issue of women toward violence towards women. Okay, okay, because this is what Cohen and Kennedy say. A reason why sociologists begin to look beyond national borders was that the new order emerging at the end of the Second World War. And the end of the Second World War established a new world systems with the United States at its core. So Wallerstein, 2006. So what this is telling the reader, that this sentence was inspired by his ideas, because he uses the phrase world systems as well as core. All right. This also shows the reader that you have a very extensive knowledge of the literature review that you could use to relate to your particular topic. And this is what professors look for. right? And this would actually help you stand out from other students in whatever sociology class that you're taking. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. And but if it doesn't, you could mention it or ask me questions about this in class. Okay. All right, so let me continue. For instance, by the 1970s, Japan had become an economic competitor of the United States rather than a military competitor during the Second World War. Japan rose as an economic power during the 70s. Since Japan is a non Western nation, although it lost the Second World War, was able to make significant economic and manufacturing advances to compete in the global market. From cars like Toyota and Honda to electronic companies like Sony, Toshiba, JVC, and Sharp allowed Japan to become an economic powerhouse during the late 20th century. All right, and then you'll notice that I have a quote here. Gradually, sociologists working in Europe and North America began to appreciate that they needed to widen their comparative perspective. All right, Cohen and Kennedy, 2013, page 23. As Cohen and Kennedy have shown, there is a necessity to understand the world that people live in. In turn, this study follows Cohen and Kennedy's argument in trying to understand how violence impacts women's well being. All right. And then, I might write another sentence or so to sort of close this paragraph off. But then that's sort of the general process that you're going to go through. You present the argument, well, you present your topic, you present what the topic is about, and when you get to your sources, you sort of have to summarize what the argument of the source is and then make that connection to of that source to your argument. And then you show evidence to support that claim. Okay. Yeah. So then this is what I wrote for this parenthetical comment. So you notice how the example I had identified the four course readings at the beginning of this section. You will also note how I provided a brief description and explanation of Cohen and Kennedy's argument along with the quote I used from them, and how I contextualized it within the study's object of study. You'd repeat this process with the other three sources, but do not take shortcuts because shortcuts will lead to poor writing and underdevelopment of your ideas. I will focus on developing three preliminary questions about the topic. So then this is part three, the research questions. So this is what it's supposed to look like. So here is the introductory paragraph. Here are the three listed questions, as I mentioned in the prior video going over this section. And then here is the paragraph. Right. Showing the reader how it relates back to your topic. Right. So let me just read this section. The following preliminary questions will help to delimit the focus of this series. Sorry. The following preliminary questions will help. Sorry, the following preliminary questions will help to delimit the focus for this research proposal. So here I have my first question. In what ways is globalization a patriarchal system? How does globalization structure violence towards women? And how do women experience violence in a globalized context? If you notice, all three of these questions can be related or observed in the lit review as well as the introduction. And this is what I meant when I went over the research question section, that you have to draw your questions out from the literature review and as well as the introduction. This is how you're able to check to make sure that you're remaining logically consistent. And then later on, I'll show you how you could use these questions to make sure that you're being empirically consistent in your arguments. Okay. So then you'll notice also the other thing that you should notice is that the questions are simple. They're not compound questions. They're not 5 or 6 part questions. It's just one simple question that is just asking and framing a particular topic. Okay. And then once you're done listing the three questions, then you're just going to write like a paragraph like this, or maybe something a little longer. The three preliminary questions will help to frame how violence affects women on a global scale. As Cohen and Kennedy have demonstrated, it is essential to comprehend the reality people live under. By exploring this topic, it is expected to inform the general public about the dangerous circumstances women may find themselves in, but not of their own making. Global capitalism can be an exploitive system when you are considered part of a vulnerable community. Unfortunately, women face many forms of violence, whether they live in an advanced nation state or in a developing nation state. And then, sort of like continue about how nation states are impacted by violence. All right, just to sort of make sure that the sentence is a complete sentence. Right. All right. And are impacted by violence. All right. And then I wrote this parenthetical comment where I wrote, you'd continue with your description and explanation of how your questions help you frame your topic. So you would just sort of continue a little bit longer to be able to make those connections. And then you're done with the research questions. But remember, this is how this section is supposed to look. All right. It's not supposed to look like this or like the other sections of the paper. All right. So it's just to look specifically like this because it makes it easier for me to identify the three questions and also to write any commentary if I need to write commentary in this section. Okay. All right. And then the outcome. So, part four, the outcome. It is expected that the study will help the researcher understand the situations and circumstances that many women face when it comes to material and immaterial forms of violence. What is driving this study is the notion that women, as well as men, have a right not to experience violence and to have the right to live in a safe and free, and have the right to live in a safe and violent free global order. Right. And then the second paragraph is identifying what your reader should draw out once they read your completed manuscript. For future readers, it is expected that they will have a better understanding of globalization as well as how violence is organized against women. Women have survived violence, but sadly, many women have not survived unwanted violence, and the data shows how extensive this problem is. The rise uh, the rising sorry about that, of awareness of violence against women, the manuscript will inform readers that about this serious topic. It is also expected that reading the completed manuscript may encourage then the reader to research further and potentially engage in some form of community activism. All right, so then this is how you would sort of conclude and write out your section for the outcome. But do you notice the logic of how this essay structure and format helps you develop your ideas and how it able to create a cohesive argument focusing on one issue, but looking at the different dimensions of that one issue? All right. And that you notice that I develop one set of ideas about one issue or topic, and then once I'm done with that, then I go to the next issue, right? And then I develop those ideas. I just don't sort of do like a shotgun shell writing where you just sort of write one or two sentences, then you go to the next idea, or one or two sentences, go to the next idea. That does not help you, nor does it help your reader, because your reader doesn't understand the full comprehension of your ideas because there's ideas missing. All right, so you want to make sure that you're thoughtful, that you're careful with your words, and that you're presenting your ideas in the best way imaginable. All right, so I'm going to stop here and I'm going to post this on YouTube and then on Canvas.